Just want to make sure my note taker's there. Yeah, so it is recording. How's it, Charlene?
Hello.
Cool. Well, I know everyone's time is precious, so I think we'll get a start. If anybody joins as we go along, I do encourage you to interrupt me, question me. I think for me, this is probably arguably more important than it is even for you guys, because it's the kind of questions that get asked, and it gives us very valuable insight into what people don't understand. And I think one of the things with climate change and carbon footprints that I've certainly noticed over the years, and noticed working with a lot of you guys, is a lot of it is one of these fields, and I think it's probably an inherent problem with conservation in general, is we tend to communicate important things with very complicated acronyms and data and statistics, and which makes it really meaningful to the average person. I think a lot of this is driven by, people do this work because it's driven by emotion and a need to want to make a change. And so I really hope that what we go through today is of some value. And like I said, if you've got any questions, I really encourage you to just pop something into the chat or interrupt me. I think the more we unpack things, the as we go along, the more things will make sense. But I think my goals here is to just not to turn everybody into carbon accountants. It's really about just giving you the knowledge that you can actually start asking better questions, because I think that's the whole role of carbon footprint reporting, is to get answers to questions that we can't understand. And it gives us really interesting insights into how our business operates, what our impact is on the planet. So as a kickoff, I've got two lodges here. One's got a carbon footprint of 410 tons, and the other one's got a carbon footprint of 264 tons. Does anybody want to take a stab at which one is better? Instinctively, where would you put your guesses? Which is the better lodge?
Lodge B.
Yeah. And
That's
bear that in mind.
Instinctively, by the way.
Yeah, instinctively, and that's where we go. And when we get to the end of this presentation and we've kind of got the context, I'll actually reveal the full story, because I think that is, for me, if I had to identify one real problem with carbon footprints, is we do think about it as a number, and it is a number. But a number is totally irrelevant if it hasn't got context around them, and the numbers can lie. The numbers don't necessarily show effort. So once we've been through this workshop this morning, one of our last slides will actually look at this example again, and we'll have more information and we'll understand things better, and then we can actually see which one is better. But also I want to just talk about this before we get further on, is this idea that certain things are better than other things. And I think here's a great example. What do we think instinctively is better, spending money on solar or getting your drivers to slow down and change the way they drive their vehicles to save some diesel?
I would assume solar.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would also assume solar.
Yeah. And this is a really interesting one, is solar does make a very positive impact, but its impact is immediate. What we've seen over certainly our data, is the bigger impact actually happens with vehicles and diesel and cutting back. And that's one of the biggest areas, certainly across everybody we've worked with. Diesel well, there's a couple of exceptions, but diesel for game viewers is the single biggest emission source across all of them. And we've seen that by cutting diesel spend, we've seen a third reduction in total carbon footprint. Solar is an interesting one because, and I'll explain this a little bit more, because it's not really a total reduction. It's actually an avoided emission. So you're avoiding using Eskom, or you're avoiding using a generator. It saves you money and it saves you emissions that would have been there, but it's a very difficult thing to reduce, because once you put in the solar, that's it. You don't that impact can't be built on, and it's not continuous. And yeah, certainly from our data, the free things, something like just changing driving styles, slowing down, really managing how you're using fuel at lodges is probably one of the biggest impact areas. Here's another one. We've got a lodge property that's 47 kilograms per bed night and another property with 20 kilograms per bed night. Which ones run better?
You would assume the one with 20.
You would assume the one with 20, and that would be a very good assumption. And the per bed night is a very strong benchmark we use, but we've actually, one of our lowest total carbon footprint properties in our database actually has a rather high bed night figure. And that is simply because that particular property has a remarkably low occupancy rate. It's running at an occupancy of about 14–15%. So understanding the context it is, again, very, very important. So what I'm trying to say is just that these numbers don't necessarily tell the full story unless you've got the context around it. So in this particular case, property A is certainly was doing a far better job. Everything gets recycled, hardly any fossil fuels are used, everything was off grid, but because of their low occupancy rate, it inflated their figure. All they've got to do is increase their occupancy to 30%, and that figure would drop right down below 20. Not that being said, the bed night thing is a really useful indicator, but it's understanding the math behind it and understanding these little nuances and the context that actually makes the carbon footprint important information and gives you important answers. The bare number on its own is really a meaningless thing, and I think that's probably one of my core messages here. Is the number on its own doesn't mean anything unless you can answer questions from that number and dig into it a bit deeper. There's another little caveat I've dropped in here, and this is again where carbon can actually help us make really good decisions. We had a very interesting exercise with a client of ours who had given everybody, instead of plastic bottles, they give everybody a take-home branded aluminium flask, and it was an aluminium flask with high density plastic around it. And instinctively, you would think that's a far better option and a far lower impact. And when we actually looked at it, the aluminium was imported from China. It had a very, very long value chain. But this particular property in their local town, there was about a 90% recovery rate on plastic bottles. So the recycling rates were very high. And it actually turned out that the plastic bottles was a better option than the aluminium bottles from a climate perspective. And context is really important here. In a remote camp in Botswana, that could be a very different story where you don't have nearby recycling facilities. But the point is the data can actually, being able to understand these things and measure these things gives us opportunity to do these little environmentally friendly things that we do around camps and lodges, to really embed some evidence in it. And in the case where we had found the plastic bottles to be better, we actually said, this is a conversation you need to have with your guests. When guests look at the plastic bottle and cringe, you need to have a conversation and be able to explain why you made that decision. And a carbon footprint really gives really useful data on this. And a similar thing that we come across really regularly is, oh, well, by having vegan meals, by default, we're going to have a lighter carbon footprint. And instinctively, that is correct, but it's not actually correct. All meat is not the same. A free-range cow in Botswana, for example, can't be compared to beef from a factory farm in the United States. All meat is not the same. A locally sourced chicken or fish caught from a local river is almost inevitably going to have a smaller carbon footprint than tofu that's been imported from several thousand kilometers away. So my point here is that sometimes the labels also don't really tell the story. And having this information and being able to actually take these things that we do around our properties and being able to talk with confidence on why we've done this, why we've made these decisions, and actually have the data to present to people is really, really, really valuable. But it also helps us avoid these little traps of just doing things because they're topical, they're sexy, you know, things like plastic bottles, things like vegan meals. Everybody sees this in the media every day, and they're very topical issues. But the point with carbon is it gets rid of all the fluff, it gets rid of all the hype, and it really breaks things down into very raw numbers that people can understand, and it tells you the truth. And the truth is always embedded in there. And the context changes for everything. A vegan meal versus a meat meal, maybe in a city restaurant in Johannesburg, could be a very different scenario to a vegan meal and a meat meal in a remote lodge in Zambia, for example. So that context is so, so important. And all of these things are remarkably nuanced. And what carbon footprint reporting allows us to do is break through the nuance and actually get the facts and the data. So I think my message with those few slides is carbon footprint is not an answer. By measuring your carbon footprint, that is not an answer or an end result. It's really just a start, because it helps you to ask the right questions, like what's driving my carbon footprint? What's what are the big levers? Where are the big hotspots? Where are we wasting? It allows you to look at completeness and accuracy. Are you guessing things? Are there things you're doing on your property or in your lodge or in your business that have a material impact on the planet that you haven't actually measured? Most importantly, how is it changing over time? How does it compare with other similar operations, and what opportunities does it reveal? So I think that for me is a really key aspect, and speaks to those earlier slides I went through. That it's not, carbon footprint is not giving you an answer. It's giving you an opportunity to ask the right questions and actually make better decisions going forward. It's looking at things like continuous improvement, being able to compare yourself fairly against similar properties. Because if you just took a carbon footprint for one property and they've got a game drive vehicle and the other property doesn't have a game drive vehicle, then you're not making a fair comparison. It's not a fair benchmark. So by asking these sort of questions and looking at this over time, it really allows the impact and the real value of a carbon footprint to start coming out. So I think carbon accounting, it's the science behind the story, but the world is drowning sustainability claims. Everybody's got a story about the trees they've planted, or the local sourcing they've done, or the green badge they've got. And the more important question is, what has changed? How much has it changed? Compared to what? And how do we know that that's actually accurate? And those are the questions that carbon footprint reporting, we hope with carbon footprint reporting, we can actually start answering. It's really understanding what has changed and how much has it changed compared to what. So by no means am I saying things like solar panels and tree planting and local sourcing are inherently bad things, but they're not very valuable things if you don't know the impact of those initiatives. And that's really what carbon accounting gives us. Has anybody got any questions on that first bit for me? Anything they want to sort of ask or query or check in on?
Duncan,
I think it's all. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. Roland, how's it?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I just having flashbacks to the Fair Trade Tourism certification process that we were going through, where one section was, how do you communicate your sustainability practices? And what I'm just hearing through this is there are so many buzzwords around there, but it's the understanding around what that is and how that local context is. So that's really coming out very strongly for me this morning, and it just creates then a lot of opportunity for engaging your guests around us. So it's also about then having communication devices kind of like in the public spaces, around the breakfast table, at the check-in, etc., so that you inviting people to have those conversations, and that you didn't just reiterate and educate these broader dynamics that need to be considered, and that it is always about the context.
Absolutely. And I think I like what you said there about the storytelling, because I think that's a lot of what comes out of this process. It allows you to tell those rich sort of stories, and they can be very different stories. We've had, just in the past week, I had a conversation yesterday with a property up in Tanzania, that used to use glass bottles because everybody demanded it. And they've ended up going back to plastic bottles because everything gets flown in and the glass is just too heavy and it has a massive impact on their transport. There's another hotel in Cape Town that uses no plastic bottles. They use glass bottles that get refilled. But the bottling factory is just 5 kilometers away from them. You know, so you've got two very different approaches to the same problem, but very, very different stories to tell. And I think it's understanding the background that allows you to really tell that rich story and break it down into the really important parts. And this is something I would really like to get some ideas from you guys as well on this next slide. But, you know, we often get asked, you know, tourists don't necessarily always ask, what is your carbon footprint? And if you tell them what your carbon footprint is, they don't really care. And, you know, so why should we even be vaguely bothering about this? And I think the first one is really important, is especially in the ecotourism industry, you know, we're selling nature, we're selling the environment, the very asset that we're relying on for our businesses to thrive. Climate threatens that. You know, so I think there is almost an intrinsic value or an ethical question around that, is that, you know, we almost have a duty in the tourism industry to do the right thing and be part of making sure that the places we sell are actually protected. You know, so, and this goes beyond the guest experience. It really goes into, you know, the ethics and ethos behind your business. But beyond that, you know, tourists don't regularly ask what a carbon footprint is, but we've certainly seen over the past 5 years, I would say probably about 80% of our clients only approach us because somebody has demanded it. Somewhere along the line, a travel agent has said, are you measuring your carbon footprint? What is it? What is your trajectory? We're seeing it popping up more and more on procurement forms. So there's certainly a move towards this. And I think particularly amongst, you know, maybe less so with guests, but travel partners and investors, it's definitely becoming a bigger thing. We're seeing it a lot on sort of loan accounts and where you've got third parties investing, where their reporting structure requires carbon footprint reporting. So they are asking these tougher questions. Things like, you know, what have you measured? What's changed compared to what? And I think the era of sustainability promises is starting to fade, and really what's going to build trust with stakeholders and travel agents, and this will certainly pan out, I think, more strongly. If I look at the trajectory over the past 5 years, it's going to become even more pressing, is that need to build trust. And it's very similar to having a good set of financials. You know, if you've got a good set of financials that's very transparent about your income and your expenses and what's happening in the business, you build trust with your stakeholders and your investors. And I think that a similar thing sits with the carbon footprint report, because it's providing the evidence to the claims that we're making. And a lot of sustainability work and a lot of sustainability claims are quite qualitative by nature. Whereas your carbon footprint is kind of the one area where it's very quantifiable and it's indisputable and it's a globally accepted standard. So we're all comparing apples and apples and talking about the same thing. But I think beyond that, I often say it doesn't matter what your opinion is on, and this is something that actually fascinates me sometimes, what your opinion is on climate change. You could sit there and think the whole climate change debate is a total conspiracy theory. It's not happening. But every single source of emissions in your business has an invoice attached to it. You know, a 10% reduction on diesel means a 10% reduction on your overhead costs. 10% less on electricity means 10% less on your electricity costs. So understanding these efficiencies, to me, makes just absolute business sense. And sometimes you don't see those sort of things. They don't stick out like a sore thumb on a financial statement. But when you're looking at a carbon footprint report, and we've said, well, look, your camp is using, say, 14 kilograms of LPG gas per, well, 14 kilograms is ridiculous monthly, say 1 kilogram of LPG gas per bed night. But the camp down the road is using 200 grams of LPG gas per bed night. and they've got similar occupancies and a similar size operation. What are you doing differently? So it allows you to really zoom in and see where those inefficiencies are. And with lower costs, higher efficiencies, it makes your business more resilient, and it makes you more competitive. So overall, it's better for business. It's better for the place that we operate in and the places we love. And I do think over time that does translate through to the guest experience. And that's something we want to work through in the next few modules, is really making this something that's actually meaningful to your guests, because that's one of the bigger challenges here. So yeah, in the future, I don't think the businesses with the greenest marketing are going to be the ones who succeed. It'll be the ones that people trust. And trust is earned through transparency, and transparency comes from evidence. And I think this is even more important in kind of an AI world where, we're going to be just seeing a lot more stuff that's just really not real, authentic, hand on your heart, honest transparency of who you are, what are you doing? Yes, this is our impact, and this is what we're doing to make things better. I really do believe that that's going to stand out in the future. But we'll talk a lot more about this in one of the, I think it's the session in October, when we look at communicating and marketing around a carbon footprint. So I've got a few slides here where I want to just go through the jargon and see if we can make it a little bit more simple and stick, because it's complicated language, and most of it's just it's common sense wearing a lab coat. So your carbon footprint, essentially, the first one there it's the combination of you can think of it as a profit and loss sheet. This is the equivalent to a financial profit and loss, where it's got all of your ins and outs. So your total carbon footprint is all the sources of emissions and the avoided emissions and offsets that you might have. So you can think about it as a general ledger, for example, and it's made up of things like fuels, electricity, food, and waste. Another one we find tricky to understand is your carbon footprint equivalent. So when we're reporting on carbon footprints, we use CO2e, the equivalent of a ton of carbon, because there's a whole variety of greenhouse gases that cause harm to the atmosphere: CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, and everything in your carbon footprint, whether you see it or not, is causing smoke. The smoke from your exhaust fumes is quite visible. The smoke from your firewood, you can see it. LPG gas, you see the smoke less, but there's stuff burning. Even electricity, somewhere up the power line, there's a power station burning something to provide electricity. So, and even when your waste ends up on landfill, that waste breaks down and it releases methane. So everything actually has a little trail of smoke behind it, and various gases coming out of the smoke. So what the CO2 equivalent does is you can think of it almost as an exchange rate. So what we can take is all of these different gases and combine them into one thing to give you a common currency that we can work with. So you might have guests paying you in dollars, other guests paying you in euros, but at the end of the day, you can combine it all into rands and cents and understand your business in that way. And this is really what we do at the carbon footprint. We're taking all these other various emission sources, but like we would receive different sorts of currencies, and we just convert it into a common currency, and that's CO2 equivalent. Because it'd just be remarkably complicated to report on carbon dioxide, report on methane, report on nitrous oxide, and then a whole host of other potential gases. So it just makes it one simple number. And I think that's the carbon dioxide equivalent. So we're not actually talking about pure carbon dioxide. We're talking about a whole bunch of potentially polluting gases combined into a single currency. The emissions factor is, you could almost think of it as a conversion chart on the back of your recipe book. We already know that we've bought 160 liters of diesel. And the emissions factor is just the number that tells us what does this mean in climate terms. Nobody makes these emissions factors up. They are published through every year. They get updated through extensive sort of research methodologies around the world. And it just gives us this, again, the standard conversion rate that we can use to say, sure, what is the carbon footprint of a liter of diesel? It just gives us a very straight number that we can multiply it by to understand that particular source of emissions. And those emissions factors are published and printed and widely available for every possible source of smoke that you can imagine in any sort of business. So they're very widely available. They're very simple numbers. In diesel, for example, it's 2,66. So for every liter of diesel, you're producing 2,66 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. And so it makes it just a very simple way to convert volume into carbon dioxide. The emission source. So when we're going through a greenhouse gas inventory and a carbon footprint at your property, we'll talk about these emission sources. And people always talk about emission sources as if it's a homogeneous thing, but they're actually various taps filling up your bathtub. You know, the generator might be one tap, your game drive vehicle might be another, the laundry could be another, the gas in the kitchen is another, the firewood's another. And all of those come together, all of those taps feed into a single bathtub, which actually becomes your carbon footprint. Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions, I think for a lot of you, these we do understand, but really Scope 1 is the important stuff. These are things that you should be able to measure with absolute accuracy because you're directly spending money on petrol, diesel, firewood. Scope 1 are things that you own. So they would be your own car, your own generator, gas in your own kitchen. These are assets generally that you own, and they almost always in Scope 1, they're producing direct smoke, visible smoke. There's no maybe down the bottom there. So I always find that's a really nice rule of thumb for Scope 1 emissions. You know, if you say to yourself, has this produced some sort of smoke somewhere? And if it's yes, it's probably a Scope 1 emission. Scope 2 emissions are only when you're buying electricity from a power station, from Eskom. In South Africa, it's exclusively Eskom. For most of Africa, there's just a single source. But in Europe and Americas, you can actually buy your power from a variety of different places, and they've got different impacts. But this is just your upstream. For most of us, this would be restricted to anything you're buying from Eskom, and it's the impact of your electricity. And then Scope 3 is everything that happens before and after the guest stay. And these are things that you've got control over, but you don't necessarily own them. This could be things like third-party logistics, somebody delivering food to your property on a weekly basis. It could be things like business travel. You don't own the airline that you fly with, but you do have an impact. It is a decision that you make to actually use that service. Waste is a similar one. And they're not always direct, not the actual footprint of those activities are not directly under your control, but how you use them tends to be under your control. So when you often hear people talking about the value chain emissions, they're talking about Scope 3 emissions. And these are by far the most uncertain of the whole lot, because it's not stuff you've actually got exact data on. So I think my message with those is really you control what you can, which is really Scope 1, track what you use, and use the information from that to influence the bigger picture. It might mean changing the way you procure your food and beverage to your property. It might mean another supplier who's closer and has a less of a carbon footprint to get things to you. But having that baseline measure, and that's the next one, helps you just map that trajectory and understand where you're going with that. So the baseline is really, it's your opening balance. You know, this is your starting point. And it's not a shame number. We often recommend to people the uglier your baseline is, the better, because it allows you to actually show your improvement over time. So without having that opening balance, if you think about it as again, in a business context, you know, you can't show how your business has grown if you don't have a point where your business started from. And this is really what the baseline is. This is a thing that we're going to measure against going into the future. So if we've got a baseline for year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, we can look at how have we been performing. Are we better than that original baseline? Are we worse? Oh, because we're getting actually worse than our baseline. We need to do the things differently, find out why. So that's baseline is when they talk about a baseline carbon footprint, it's just your simple terms. It's your very first carbon footprint you ever do. And that baseline will become your reference point going forward. And that's really important because again, when we used that first example, when we showed those two numbers, you know, understanding where those two properties came from, what was their baseline, where did they start? One's at 400 tons, the other's at 200 tons, but knowing what they were 2 years ago would actually tell you if they're on a good trajectory or a bad trajectory. And then a couple of these, and this is one where feel free to stop me if you need to, because I think,
Duncan?
yeah.
David had a question in the chat asking, is the emission factor the same for all activities? Diesel,
No.
gas, rubbish?
No. So each activity would have its own emissions factor. And what I'll do is when I share the notes from this meeting, I'll also I'll share with you it's a little Excel file with all the emissions factors in. So as an example, ones I know off the top of my head, like diesel, I said was 2.66 kilograms per liter. Petrol is a little bit better. Petrol is 2.3 kilograms, I think. LPG gas is about 3,000 kilograms per ton of LPG gas. But then you've got other emissions factors, like emissions factors for flights, where each passenger kilometer is 0.05. So basically, they've got different emissions factors for each activity, because burning a liter of petrol doesn't have the same impact on the climate as burning a liter of, say, paraffin. There's a difference in how they combust and the gases that they release versus burning a kilogram of firewood. Each of those activities produce slightly different gases and slightly different emissions. And the emissions factor is actually measuring exactly what are the emissions from those different little activities. What is the mix of gas? So yeah, no, they don't all have the same emissions factor. Each emission source would have its own emissions factor. And I do have a little slide after this where we go through just an example of what it would look like when you can see how those volumes translate into different amounts of carbon. Were there any other questions there? Cool. So I think the intensity ratio, and this is probably a more important number than your actual carbon footprint. This is in a tourism environment, it's typically the kilograms per bed night. But if you were a manufacturer who built vehicles, for instance, like Toyota, their intensity ratio is probably how many tons per vehicle manufactured. If you were running a retail shop, you might use an intensity ratio of how much ton per 100,000 Rand revenue. And the beauty of the intensity ratio and why it's probably more valuable figure than your total carbon footprint is, it lets you benchmark yourself much better against peers and similar businesses. But what it also does is it allows you to have a comparative figure as your business grows. So if you think about Toyota, it's a ton per vehicle they manufacture. And year one, they manufacture 1,000 vehicles. Year two, they manufacture 2,000 vehicles. The business is growing. They're manufacturing more. Their carbon footprint is going up. But they're also getting more and more efficient. So what you should find is, yes, your carbon footprint might go up as your business grows. But with that growth comes economies of scale and more efficiency. So as your bed night numbers go up, as your sales go up, your intensity per bed night should start coming down. So really just all it allows us to do is, if you've been through a stage where your business has grown significantly, you might have built another 4 or 5 chalets or built a whole new lodge, inevitably your carbon footprint is going to go up. But be able to measure that and make a comparison, like how are we actually doing year on year from a carbon perspective, this intensity ratio is really the figure that will tell you the story, because it takes into account your growth. The benchmark is something that and I think this is really something that really excites me, and the valuable part of what we've been doing in this particular program is being able to say with a fair amount of confidence, what should we be using in terms of petrol in a game drive vehicle, for example. We've got some that are using 14 liters per bed night, others that are using 3. And somewhere in there is an average, somewhere in there is best practice, somewhere in there is a lodge with a, has very poor controls over their diesel. But within all of that information allows us to actually start comparing similar properties side by side. And within that, we can also then identify really good opportunities when we can benchmark against our peers. And again, that's that carbon footprint number, that per bed night emissions. It's a meaningless number unless you know, what are the average other properties producing per bed night? How much electricity are similar properties using? How much diesel are similar properties using? And when you understand that sort of context, it also starts giving you a space of, okay, where are we sitting? Oh, wow, we're using so much more diesel than the property next to us, who have got almost an identical operation. Let's look at how we can reduce that. And we've actually got evidence that it's possible. So the benchmarking is a really valuable process and something that we've been very lucky to build quite an extensive database on. And I think this is really going to be where you can also start telling much stronger stories, your carbon footprint compared to what. When you start talking about fuel in a game drive vehicle, being able to have a conversation with your guests that, hey, this is one of our biggest emission sources, and we're changing our policy to slow down our game drives because we know that other properties are doing it, and it's really a good thing to do for the environment. And being able to kind of articulate that and make that story, benchmarking gives us that sort of value. But the next four are the really controversial and possibly confusing ones that I want to make sure we all understand, because these terms are often used, and I even use them interchangeably sometimes. But what we are seeing, this new EU regulation coming in around greenwashing and things, is that using the right language is actually becoming really, really important. So avoided emissions. These would be an examples if you used a generator for the past 10 years and you made a decision to change that to solar, so you're no longer using 1,000 liters of diesel. What you're doing is actually turning off one of your taps, or at least reducing the flow through one of those taps. And those are avoided emissions. So those are things that you've done to replace an existing emission source or to really reduce an emission source. When we talk about insetting, these are generally things outside of your property. So where you've got influence. So it could be around waste. It could be around third-party transport. It could be around where you're procuring your food from. And these are this is what they call insets. So very, very similar to avoided emissions, except the insetting is really where you're having an influence rather than actually making that direct change. Offsetting, on the other hand, is helping pay for that cut somewhere else. So it's not an actual reduction inside your lodge, but it plays a big role, and it doesn't make those emissions disappear. And I think this is a really important part of offsetting. And one of those things that's coming out in the EU legislation is that you can't now say we're carbon neutral because we've offset. You need to be, you still actually have that impact. You're still burning the same amount of diesel, same amount of electricity, and you might have gone and purchased carbon credits somewhere. Your impact is still the same. So when you're offsetting, this would mean in most places, you've got the option of buying carbon credits. So these would be projects that are helping reduce climate change. They could be afforestation projects, renewable energy projects, and you can buy these carbon credits and offset your emissions. And they are quite controversial. But essentially what you're doing, there's been no meaningful change to your actions versus that. And carbon neutral is really when you balance the two out. So you've got 100 tons of carbon, you've gone and offset 100 tons of carbon by removing carbon somewhere else. You've created this carbon neutral thing. So if you had a scenario where you've got 100 tons and you reduce 70 tons by efficiency, and then you avoid another 30 tons through nature-based projects, then you start becoming what they call net zero. So carbon neutral and net zero are subtly different, because you are actually balancing off that impact. You're not paying for that impact to happen somewhere else. So I think the difference there is offsetting is happening outside of your property. It's away from your operations. Whereas to really reach this idea of net zero that you probably a lot of in the media and on the news, it's really about minimizing your own impact as much as possible, and then remove and avoid through other sort of projects that you've got direct influence over. But yeah, both of these are, I always suggest being very wary of saying you're carbon neutral, because there's not a single solitary person on this planet that is carbon neutral. The moment we wake up in the morning and boil the kettle for our coffee, we're producing carbon. We always are. And I think there's a far stronger case for transparency. And this is the impact, and these are the things we're doing to minimize that impact, than trying to, for use of a better word, pretend that impact isn't there, because every single one of us do it. And even if somebody comes on holiday, yes, they've got an impact, but if they'd stayed at home, they still would have had an impact. If they didn't come, take a German tourist in the middle of winter, if that person might come to a lodge in Africa and it's got a carbon footprint of 20 kilograms a bed night, he's having an impact. But if that person had just stayed at home, he probably would have had a similar carbon footprint, because the gas heaters would have been turned up and it's cold, and then we're driving in our car to go and get groceries. And so I think the whole thing of carbon neutral is inherently dangerous, because it never actually happens, and we all have an impact, whether we're at home or on holiday. It's always there. Has anybody got any questions on any of these terms, especially the avoided emissions and offsetting and the difference between the two, and where to focus our efforts there?
Duncan, there was a sort of related question, I guess, from Chris in the chat.
Yeah.
Have you considered measuring the CO2 against metrics like land or species conserved, such like as a way of introducing the positive side of environmental impact?
Yes. So on the land, we have we've done this a few times. I think one of the properties we're actually working with in the verified impact program in the garden route, he's rehabilitated a vast amount of land from pine plantation, and then it went into really degraded land, and that's been thousands and thousands of trees planted. And we've been able to measure that the carbon sequestrated and stored there is, I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it's a factor of like 400 times more than the carbon footprint of the lodge itself. So those are very valuable stories to tell, because tourists who are worried about the impact of long haul travel, when you look at it in that sort of context, yeah, the lodge has got a carbon footprint. Everybody has, but actually what's being stored and sequestrated because you are visiting this place becomes a really important story. So absolutely, yes, when it comes to the biomass and the sequestration of trees and things, it can definitely be measured. And if you've got land that you've rehabilitated or conserving, I definitely encourage you to think of that in terms of how do you tell that story and measure those. But in terms of one of the things that an intrinsic weakness with carbon footprint reporting is it doesn't consider biodiversity. And there are a lot of talks, discussion papers, plans, methodologies around what they call biodiversity credits. We were actually kind of considering biodiversity in terms of a carbon landscape, because in technical terms, planting a whole bunch of blue gum trees could make you carbon neutral, because those trees are storing carbon and they're sequestrating, but from a biodiversity perspective, it's absolutely horrendous. So yes, it can we need to speak more about what is being conserved in carbon terms, because when you look at that in terms of people's concern around long haul travel and the impact of the airline industry, for example, and you look at what's actually conserved because people are traveling to these places, it's a factor of many, many, many thousands more tons of carbon are being conserved and being sequestrated and stored than are actually being produced. So it's a very important story to tell. associated with that also is that, you know, tourism, ecotourism is considered a climate mitigation tool, you know, which also is a little bit, got a lot of activists and people saying we shouldn't travel, we should, you know, it's bad for the environment. But in terms of being able to adapt to changing climates and helping communities who are reliant on agriculture find other ways of generating income to be able to protect new patches of forests and savannas and grasslands, we need tourism to do that. So it's tourism in itself is a recognized, documented climate mitigation tool. So yes, yeah, in terms of biodiversity, it's a big weakness with carbon accounting, but certainly the land that's conserved, that is probably one of the more important stories that need to be told. Any other questions? Cool. So what I'm going to do in the next 2 slides is just take you through practical examples. This is, I've actually populated these with an average of all of everything in our database, on-grid, off-grid. And this is how things are kind of measured. And there's like some interesting insights here. Diesel from vehicles, so off-grid lodges are typically using about 19,000 liters a year, on-grid 22,000. Oh, sorry, that says kilowatt hours, should be something else. But if you look at the total tonnage, on-grid and off-grid, their vehicles are very similar. Generators, interestingly, the off-grid guys are producing a whole lot more smoke from generators than on-grid people because they're reliant on backup power. And I think this is an important consideration. They're using 3 times more generator diesel than your on-grid peers. So if you are going to get solar and go off-grid, making sure that's actually spec'd correctly and can handle the load. So you're not just having a little bit of solar for nice to look at, but it's actually doing its job. Interesting difference in LPG gas in cooking, off-grid 6 tons, on-grid on average 11 tons. And I think this is also a nuance of using a lot more firewood to cook, larger kitchens. It's quite a big anomaly there. And these are averaged examples from my entire database. So understanding the little nuances and the benchmarks there they're messy, and it'll be neat some looking in. But firewood similar, paraffin similar. So if you look at the actual emissions from for scope 1, an off-grid lodge and an on-grid lodge are actually really, really similar. There's not much in it, 79 versus 73 tons. But the big difference comes in when you look at scope 2, grid electricity. The off-grid lodges, we've got, one of them is obviously hybrid, using a little bit of electricity. And the other one's producing 239 tons. So when you look at it like that, suddenly that bit of extra diesel for the generators doesn't make much of an impact. But you can see the remarkable difference there that grid electricity actually makes. But it's not something, yeah. But yeah, hands down in the scope 1 emissions, the stuff you've got direct control over. And I say you do have control over electricity. You do have direct control over how that electricity gets used, but you don't necessarily have control over how efficiently that electricity is being generated. You know, we don't have a say to Eskom, use more solar, use more natural gas instead of coal. We don't really have a say in that, but we do have a say in things like diesel in vehicles and burning LPG gas in the kitchen. Interesting, this LPG gas is just reminding me as well, there was one of the on-grid lodges which we had, and I think it might actually be the one that's skewing the data a little bit, has massive fire pits. But because they're in an urban area, they can't burn firewood. So they have these massive gas fire pits that were just using a remarkable amount of LPG gas. And then if we look down on the value chain, interesting, purchase goods and suppliers, off-grid 2 tons, on-grid 15 tons. And what we were finding there is that a lot of your on-grid properties are actually closer to urban areas and not so remote. So they'd spend a lot less time on logistics and planning. You know, when you need something ordered, it gets delivered, and it comes along. Whereas off-grid lodges in remote places were far more thoughtful about their supply chains and how they actually get things because of the distances involved. So there'd be far less deliveries and a far more control and management over that. Business travel, staff commuting, again, off-grid, more remote areas, people are living on site, on-grid, closer to urban environments or closer to towns and cities, people are living off-site and commuting. And then waste was a very small difference. But I think the point is there that, you know, every item, every decision, every partner, it all matters. And the more you can measure it and understand it and see what your neighbors are doing and what other properties are doing, the more we can actually have control over these sort of numbers. So I think, yeah, my closing slide here, and I think that's the best carbon footprint isn't the smallest one. It isn't a score, and we really need to think about it as it's a decision-making tool that gives us data and insight and intelligence into how our business is running and what is the impact of those decisions we're making. And that's for me is just like it is a decision-making tool. The moment a carbon footprint is a number that gets published, it's absolutely meaningless if it's not being used to do something more. So if we go back to our original example, I've added a whole bunch of extra information here. So we can see Lodge A had a 60% reduction, Lodge B had a 5% increase, Lodge A was 29% better than their peers, Lodge B was 33% higher than the peers. So once you start getting that information, then you can actually start making a far better assessments as to which lodge is doing better. We're looking at what has this change been over time. How much has the footprint increased or decreased? How do they perform against peers and other people who are running very similar operations? And that's really where the magic and the answers lie. They don't lie in that number. They lie in the trajectory. What has happened over time? How are we comparing? Where did we start from? And that's probably even a more important one. You could have a very high carbon footprint, but you've reduced it 75% over the past 5 years. That's still a better story than the person with a low carbon footprint who's done very little to reduce it over the past 5 years. So that's my lot, and I'm very happy to field any questions. I think just quickly going through what we're going to do with the rest of the series is you want to start tying these little bits together. You know, today was kind of a lot of information and setting the scene of all these, what a carbon footprint is and how it can be valuable. But our next session is going to be around data management. And it's typically where we find people get the most nervous is, oh, how do I get this information? And it's difficult to get hold of. And there's a lot to unpack there because you can get data from various different sources. A lot of data can start off being uncertain and it can actually become more certain. We score every, I'll show you in the next session how we score each individual emission source by data quality. You know, so again, you've got that transparency. If we've had to guess how much diesel you used, because you don't know how much diesel you use, no reason not to do your carbon footprint. We might have to make a guess based on X kilometers traveled or how much you use the vehicle, but then that gets marked as it's an uncertain or it's acceptable data or it's excellent data because there's an invoice, there's a whole audit trail behind it. So managing your carbon footprint is also about getting better at this data and improving the quality of your data over time. So I think that's and this is where most people get stuck and don't actually start because it becomes this really big thing and, oh, I need to get this absolutely right and I need to do everything perfectly. And that's really not the case. It's about continuous improvement and understanding things better. And we'll talk a lot through that on the next one. Then in August, we're looking at the low carbon kitchen. Kitchens after the game drive vehicles, probably one of the areas where you've got a bigger carbon footprint, and it's a really good opportunity to have conversations and educate guests. And telling your climate story, this is something I'm really excited about because I think guides and front-end staff are really important for them to be able to interpret what you're doing as part of the guest experience. You know, and when you're telling people that we're going to be preparing this for dinner and it's a locally sourced meal and explaining that in the context of climate and how it's helping the local economy and reducing your carbon footprint, it makes that whole experience so much more. Guides, when you're on a game drive, you know, being able to point out a landscape and relate that carbon that's being stored in the ground and in those trees to what the carbon footprint of the guests' travel might have been. You know, they're really the people that can change. And I often say I don't mind if somebody comes on holiday to Africa in a private jet with 6 times the emissions of somebody else. The fact that they're spending time in a wild place and seeing beautiful things, they get inspired. And our guides and our front end staff are the people that can actually inspire those sort of people to go home. And inevitably, most tourists, the impact's not going to be at the lodge. It's going to be when they've gone home. So we play a really big role in the tourism industry to actually influence people and make them better citizens of planet Earth. And I think our guides play a really important role here. And then on the 21st of October, it's how do we communicate this in our marketing materials without spin and avoiding the greenwash and all the jargon and things that everybody else says. And then our final session in November will be a Fiesta as well. It's what do agents and buyers want? We're seeing a lot more travel agents asking difficult questions. What do they want to see? What do they want to see for their guests? And if there's anything in any of these that anybody would like added or is uncertain or wants more information on, you know, just give us a shout anytime, and I'd be very happy to include it or find a way to slot it into one of these or do an extra session for you guys.
Yeah, Duncan, I think you've actually already answered it, but another good question from David in the chat. Is this the sort of information you would consider marketing to attract guests or businesses through travel agents, etc.? And David, from my side, yeah, as Duncan just mentioned, I will be hosting a webinar in November that's specifically about talking to travel agents and to guests and you know, how to communicate your information. And then there are also a number of other webinars that go into the climate story, how to share that with guests who are already in the lodge. And Duncan, I think the other one in September is also related to marketing.
Let me go back quickly. How do I go backwards on my slides? The September one is telling your climate story. So it's not so much marketing, that's more for front-end staff to be able to communicate your sustainability story, your carbon footprint to guests in ways that are really valuable and interesting. So I think that's more aimed at guides and front-end staff and marketing teams. The 21st October, Climate Without Spin, that's the marketing one.
Yeah. Great.
Anybody got any questions or anything that's still unclear? I really, you know, hope it's just helped get rid of some of the fluff, but I also understand that it is a, you know, it's a big topic, and yeah, happy to kind of unpack anything if anybody's got any questions.
Duncan, if we don't have a question now, but something arises in the next day or so, can I just email?
Please do. I would love that. Yeah.
All right, fantastic.
Yeah,
Thank you so
like I say, your questions are like so important to me because you know, this is stuff that I do every day, and it's like I sit with this head full of assumptions. I assume everybody knows that, and I assume everybody knows that, and I assume everybody understands. So yeah, understanding what, yeah, you know, that you don't know what you don't know. So I really, it gives me such valuable insight into how to better communicate this stuff from our side as well, and how to make your carbon footprint reports more valuable if I understand the points that people are uncertain about.
All sounds great. Thank you so much, Duncan.
Thanks so much, Duncan. I think this was quite enlightening for all of us, and yeah, it was a really great session. Thank you very much for hosting.
Thank you, guys. Thanks everybody for your time this morning. Really nice to have you all.
Thanks, Duncan.